Hi, this is MarqueeCrew, and I'd like to review a new CReW macro with you, and thank you very much for your subscription to my YouTube channel. And I'll start with a regular expression performance detour. This is the 1 million records that went into testing for these two different forms of regex versus replace char. And what I've got set up here is the ability to run performance profiling. And anyone can do that. You don't want to leave it on all the time. But enable performance profiling is an option under the workflow configuration. And there you can see from greatest time to least time how much time is being used in each tool. So 8,430 milliseconds it's spending, which is 90% of the time is inside of this regular expression. So what we'll do is we'll detour to the right and bring us into this replace char. We run, and it's now 2,330 milliseconds, or 69% of the time is spent in this function. And it runs faster. So I know this function will run faster than this function, or this expression will run faster. So when I apply that, I can actually test and know and quantify, is it worth the change to the logic? I can come back to the macro itself, and I can test with the macro. This is the CReW cleanse versus the Alteryx data cleanse tool. And what I'm going to do is take a set of data and just read in 10,000 records for time and be able to say that when I run through the detour and use the old code, it's going to take 1.7 seconds. It's very fast. But here we can see that we're 554 milliseconds, or 44% of the time. And if I detour to the right, I'm going to be 2.2 seconds, 1,200 milliseconds. So I'm using less engine to run. And if you're using this throughout workflows and you're on a shared server environment, that's time being spent on your workflow that isn't being spent on other people's workflows. Or I'm freeing up resources for everyone. When you take a look at the original data cleanse tool and we load the configuration, I want you to see that I'm going to stay true to this configuration in the new macro. And when we see that, we'll also see some differences. Regular expressions is a tab. And what I wanted to be able to achieve here is the ability to show people what is going on under the covers. Originally, there's a regex replace, a current field, with anything that's alpha into nothing. And instead of that, anything that's alpha are the letters A through Z in both upper and lower case. And so these functions don't actually do anything, but they do offer you a learning option. We have new functions in the CReW version. As I said, remove HTML tags is a function that we've got selected. In removing punctuation, I have got the ability to keep a comma or keep decimal periods. So as a user, I'm going to have a little bit more control as to what is being cleansed. In removing the data, we can remove either nulls, rows, null columns, or both. A requested feature was to convert nulls to blanks and zeros, but also, and that exists in the current macro, but alternatively, we could convert blanks and zeros back to nulls for somebody who wanted the exact opposite function. So other than that, these are really the same macros at the functional level, and they produce the same results. The original macro you saw in PowerPoint has the interface tools at the top, and then in order of processing, there's this process to remove nulls and rows, and then all of these formula fields that pull in their functions based on what is being requested by the user. So if the user says, I want to get rid of leading and trailing white space, then what happens in the action, I'll make this a little bit bigger for you to be able to see. What happens in the action is if the incoming check group, leading and trailing white spaces, if that's checked, then if the current field name is in the list selection, then trim the current field, else put in the current field, and if, else the destination, and the destination is this expression. So every record going through this, you have to decide if this stuff is true. If I've been checked, then I'm going to do something. Otherwise, I'm going to go and just keep whatever's in this field. All that work is done on every record. And when things are being cleaned up, then you're doing a little bit more work. In trying to keep this consistent, what we did was we have the interface on the left and the process on the right. And we're going to keep everything in the same structural order that they were in the original macro. That way, if somebody wanted to compare side by side, in this case it would be horizontal side by vertical side, you could see this in execution. If I try to run the macro, what would happen is I'm looking at my input has only one field, which is test field. And in this case, I've got underscore underscore test field underscore. And we're using double underscores beginning and ending of the field as a constant way to look at this is a macro field. And it shouldn't interfere or rename, conflict with other fields that are being used in real data. And in running through this, we use a field information tool. And if I change this to being detour to the right and run, you see data coming through this path now, which didn't happen when I hit run before. And when it comes through, it's saying, oh, I've got one field called test field. Now I've got one field called name, and it's test field. Now I've got to summarize, and it's concatenating all of these names together. And it's going into a formula tool, and that formula tool is going to create is null test field. Now if there were multiple fields in here, it would make it into a name that is null, and we can actually test that if you'd like. I'll take this, edit my data, and I'll say underscore underscore second field underscore, whoops, underscore underscore, and we'll just put a word in here, ARE, and run. We see the summarize tool. We see the incoming data has two field names. And what it's doing is it's creating a concatenated name. And then when it comes into the formula, we've got a formula which is then going to modify that to saying is null test field and is null second field. When I come to the remove null columns, I want to point out that the process is remove null columns. And when we go through the null columns, what we're doing is we're using a summarize tool. And what we want to be able to do in this summarize tool is be able to select all fields that are coming in and be able to create an action for all of those fields, and to be able to go and delete the columns of data. The thought came, let's look at the XML within that summarize tool. Now, this isn't a thought that's going to come to everybody. But what this looks like is I need one of these expressions for every field that you've selected. And in that, it's going to say summarize field equals the first field name selected. The action is count non-null. And what I realized in testing was that I didn't actually need this rename, and getting rid of the rename simplified the process for me. So here's my action. I need to create a list of all of these fields and create one of these lines of XML for every field that I'm interested in. That was the trick. And in trying to get that trick created, what happens is, come back to the summarize action, I was able to construct logic that would actually build the XML. So we can see that it's the summarize field and the an expression basically saying if I've got the case where I've only got one field, what do I do? If I have many fields, what do I do? And be able to construct that summarize logic. So you're welcome to open up the CReW macro, take a look, explore the macro, see what's happening, see that the applying of the renames and the fields to drop and dropping fields dynamically. And a trick in doing this, and I'm hitting Control-Z just to be able to bring this back and not have the changes in there, but if later you decide, oh, I've got this running and I would like to see what's happening at this point in the macro, the trick that I use is I add another macro output. Anywhere that I want to trap what's going on, and when I add another macro output and save, which I'm not going to do, when I save that, then the testing macro that I was using here will then have a notification that a change was made to the macro, and you'll have another anchor here, and you can see what was happening at that point in the macro. So there's a debugging or testing approach that I recommend. In the rest of the modifications, what happened was we've put in detours, so there's an action to update each detour, and then an action to update the formula. And in the case, sorry for using the word twice 2 different ways, of modify case, I didn't change anything. And so I left the logic exactly as it was before. I wasn't going to make a change to this, even though there's a slight performance improvement that we could have. We're putting in the slight performance modification here that there's a detour. It's only going to be asking, did you ask me to modify the case, when it is modifying the case. And then each of the functions has the logic below, and you can come through and see how do you replace nulls, remove letters, etc. I recommend always that you take a look at the macros. You may want to rename them and save them someplace else if you're going to modify them and play with them. If you do find an issue within the macro that you would like to report, please feel free to write me on chaosreignswithin.com. Reach out to me in the Alteryx community. It's really a pleasure putting together work like this and being able to add value to the Alteryx community. If you've got ideas, if you'd like to join in with the crew, please let me know. Thank you again for your attention here, and any feedback is welcome. Bye.